Hey everyone, you've read the intro and chapter one of When Bad Things Happen to Good People, and I wanted to just give a little bit of a um, interpretation about what we saw, maybe a simplification for some who maybe got lost in the words. It's an interesting book in that um, it's appropriate to all of us. We all, at one time or another, are either going to have to deal with the tragedy and the loss of people around us, but at the same point, we might have to deal with the losses of those whom we'll have to console. And so a book like this is very, very helpful, regardless of that. So I hope you actually have your own copy, and so that you can have that for your long-term library. Now, Kushner is a Jewish rabbi, and that's an interesting take, and we'll run into that in a couple different places in the book. But it also is helpful to know, and we figured out in the intro that he lost a son, and so not only is he someone who it's his job to console other people who've gone through tragedy, but also the idea that he went through tragedy as well, and so he was going through this struggle about dealing about with bad things happening in the world. And the reason why this is such a big deal, of course, is because so many people use this as their reason not to believe in a God, right? There are bad things that happen in the world and so many bad things, and that obviously God would never have let this happen if, if there really was a God and he really was love, he wouldn't let this happen. And so we just give up on it. Or maybe, hey, I prayed for my grandma to get better and she died of the cancer, and so now I'm either so mad at God or don't believe there could be a God because I prayed for her to get better and she didn't. So that's the value of this book, is to how do we make sense of all that? And is it possible to still believe in a God? So a few things here that when we're talking about, I want to jump right into chapter one, and I'll kind of you'll see me kind of look down at my book as I progress through these things. In chapter one, he says that we deal with all of these. Why is there suffering, right? And what causes it? And he goes through and he identifies all like five different things, different reasons, things people say, things people believe about the bad things that happen in our lives. And I want to get through those five things, and so I'll jump around and I'll share the page numbers with you. So hopefully if you want to follow along, you can. Um, the first one he talks about is on page 12. There I have is that our misfortunes come as punishments for our sins. And he uses the example of the couple whose daughter, who went to college, died of an aneurysm, and they were, instead of dealing with the loss of that, they were dealing with fear and guilt of the fact that they felt like it was their fault that she died because they hadn't fasted on last Yom Kippur, which is a holy day in the Jewish calendar. And objectively, as we look at that from a distance, we realize that's ridiculous, right? If God had worked that way, that He was punishing them for this religious infraction of not fasting on a particular holy day, that does the punishment meet the crime? A lot of the times that's what we're dealing with. And by the way, when we're talking about these bad things that happen to good people, we're not talking about a hangnail. We're talking about bigger tragedies, losing somebody you care about, um, or your business burning down, or something of a greater magnitude. And so that doesn't the first one doesn't really make sense. It doesn't make sense that we actually pay for our punishments, because oftentimes these huge losses um, are not appropriate for the bad things that we go through, right? The next thing that I want to get to, number two, and I have that on page 19. On page 19, it talks about the fact that, well, God must have his reasons for doing this, and it's not for us to question him. In the book, he uses the issue of Helen, the example of Helen, this woman who just gets multiple sclerosis, and she's frustrated that she has to fight this, and she doesn't want this. But maybe it's God's plan, right? So here's the question: How? could this plan be good for her life? Right? How could this plan be good for her husband or for her children that are going to lose her? So she gets angry at God, right? And how could and now the question is, what about her prayer? Is she allowed to pray to get better? If she does, isn't that going against the will of God? So the logic doesn't make sense with this one. This idea that God has this reasons and it's not for us to question. It doesn't make sense. Um, and it puts us in a place that opposes God, right? God has his plan, and that's to give me a terrible disease with all kinds of pain, and I'm supposed to just take it and say thank you, appreciate it, pray God that whatever you want to happen to me, including pain, comes my way. So that just doesn't help my faith life bring me closer to God when the bad things that happen to me push me away from God. So we can clearly see that God doesn't work in that way. The third thing on page 24 is that it can suffering be educational, right? Can this be a lesson? God's teaching you a lesson. And we see the example of um, the guy who works in the pharmacy, right? And so the question then becomes, if somebody's going to teach me a lesson, I need to know the lesson. If my daughter comes home one day after school and I say, go to your room, right? And don't come down until dinner. And now she goes upstairs and she's wondering, like, what did I do? Right? Like, what? And she's thinking, well, maybe I didn't put the top on the toothpaste, but that doesn't really match being sent to my room till dinner. And so she's thinking about what it could be. And then at dinner time, I call her down to dinner, right? And I let her off, but I never tell her what what the lesson was. What kind of I know that's bad parenting, right? And so if I know that's bad parenting, how much more would God know that that's not good parenting as well? So, can it make sense that God would just try to teach us a lesson, but then never tell us the lesson? I don't think so. Moving to the next one, the fourth one on page 29 deals with the idea of what if God tests us? Well, I would say that if God tests us, then first of all, that's kind of cruel. What does God need to know that he doesn't already know about us? And secondly, um, God fails. Oftentimes, we hear a lot with this one. Well, God doesn't give you anything more than you can handle, right? If something bad happens to you, you hear people say that, but that doesn't really meet the facts, and people wish that they weren't strong enough. Is that what we're supposed to do? Um, and it's kind of sadistic in that sense. So the idea that if he's testing us, he must know that many of us fail that test, right? People who terrible tragedy happens and their life just falls apart and they're never able to recover. Well, if God was testing us, he's causing us to fail. That doesn't work as well. And the last one is on page 31. It comes to liberate us from a world of pain and lead us to a better place. That, okay, if grandma died or if your mom died and you're 7, you should be happy that your mother died because she's in a better place. And God did all these things to cause her this terrible tragedy. It's better off that we're better off with the bad. Doesn't make sense. And just to kind of summarize here, or to kind of bring it to the first chapter to a close, he does there must be another approach. Maybe God doesn't cause our suffering. This is on page 35. Maybe it happens for some reason other than the will of God. He doesn't say my pain comes from the Lord or my tragedy comes from the Lord. He says my help comes from the Lord. So Kushner is suggesting that no, God did not do this to you. God does not cause the tragedy in our lives. And that's where we leave off to begin chapter 2.